so many of the narratives and books on eating disorders are written from the perspective of people who are fully recovered, such that it can make people feel as though their narratives are not really safe to share because it can feel very stigmatizing if you're in this middle place.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. Today I'm joined by author, journalist, and storyboard contributor Mallary Tenore Tarpley. She is the author of the new book Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. It's a reported memoir, with Tarpley recounting her own diagnosis and treatment for anorexia following the death of her mother from breast cancer when she was 11 years old. Tarpley offers a powerful and deeply reported look into what we know about eating disorders and how treatment is changing. As the book's title suggests, Tarpley talks about being, quote, in the middle when it comes to recovery, challenging the conventional wisdom of illness narratives where there are clear beginnings and endings. And she shares some important lessons for journalists when it comes to writing about eating disorders with care and sensitivity. Tarpley is a journalism and writing professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication and McCombs School of Business. For more on her work, there's a full reading list in the show notes. And for more information about screenings, treatments, and free to low-cost support for eating disorders, please visit the National Eating Disorder Association website to get help. There's a link in the show notes. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Mallary Tenore Tarpley. Mallary, congratulations on this book, and thank you for sharing your story with us. It's such a courageous piece of reporting about your own journey and how we think about treating eating disorders. How did this book project begin for you?
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I have been working on different iterations of this book for most of my life. I have a draft from my teenage years and another draft from my early 20s and my late 20s. So I've been conceiving of it for quite some time, but with each iteration, it changed. And in 2020, I decided that I wanted to really move forward with this book because I had drafted all these different versions, but I didn't feel like they were really getting anywhere. And I felt like I needed some more structure and support and motivation to really not just have this be this perennial back burner project, but to really turn up the flame on it and say, this is something I want to do. I want to move closer to publication. So I ended up deciding to go and get my master's in fine arts and nonfiction writing. And I got this because, again, I knew that to succeed in this program, I would have to write a thesis, and essentially this thesis would be about a third of what would become a published book. And I didn't have an advanced degree, so I thought, well, maybe this will help me just professionally as well. And it turns out that it was very beneficial for me to get this MFA. Now, I certainly don't think that you need an MFA to become a published author, but for me, the program really gave me the support and the structure that I needed. I did mine at Goucher College, and they have a low residency program. So I was able to continue working while I was also getting this degree. And it was in this program that I really fine-tuned my thinking around what I wanted this project to be and what I wanted the through line of the narrative to be. I also was able to meet my literary agent through the program. So fortuitously, they had a session where you could pitch your project to agents. And that same morning at 11 a.m., I had a personal essay published in the New York Times. And at 11:01 a.m., I jumped on this call with agents and was able to pitch the project and say, well, I just had this related piece published in the New York Times. So the stars very much aligned in that sense. And I signed on with an agent from that call shortly thereafter. But it was a long and circuitous path to publication. I went on submission with my agent. She sent the proposal to several different editors. And I ended up getting, over the course of a year, about 35 different rejections. And the old adage is that it only takes one yes. Finally, after a year and a lot of pivoting and reworking of the proposal, I did end up getting a book deal. But the book itself changed a lot from that process of initially entering the MFA program to the finished product. and happy to get into that more. But I think it's important to just note that the lifespan of a book can be quite long, and part of getting to the point where it's published really requires a lot of reflection, but also a lot of willingness to pivot and to make changes depending on where the narrative is taking you, but also where your editors may want you to go with it.
I imagine it changed in lots of different ways as you go through the MFA program and you start to understand, like, this is where you're putting a book proposal together, essentially, right? Before you meet your agent. Did it change dramatically between, what your agent saw and recommended?
Yeah, so originally when we went on submission and sent the proposal to editors the first go round, I had framed it as a literary memoir. And I thought, this is going to be a memoir in which I will do some reporting, but that reporting is primarily going to be about my life. So I will interview former medical doctors who treated me when I had an eating disorder. I will go back and interview family members. I'll look at old medical records. And so that was how I envisioned the reporting. But I found that these days it is very difficult to get a book deal for a literary memoir if you are not famous or don't have a huge platform. And so a lot of the rejections that we got were along the lines of, we just don't think we can get this beyond modest sales. You don't have a big enough platform, or we just don't think that literary memoir is selling all that well these days. So in some ways, I felt so crestfallen because I thought essentially the messaging here is that you have to be famous in order for your memoir to be deemed worthy in the eyes of a big 5 commercial publisher. But I, at the same time, was really interested in this trend that was beginning to emerge. And this sort of term came into being, and it's called Memoir Plus. And it's this idea that if you want to get a book deal for memoir, you need to be thinking about, what is your plus? And that plus could be reporting, it could be science, it could be social commentary, it could be investigation of some sort. And for me, I kept thinking, well, what is that plus? And it didn't take me very long to realize that as a journalist, that plus could be reportage. So I ended up going back to the drawing board. I stripped away that term literary memoir, and I didn't use memoir plus because it was still somewhat nascent at the time. But I reframed it as a narrative nonfiction book that would blend personal narrative alongside reporting. And so I spent a good year surveying people with lived experience with eating disorders, doing interviews, all the while knowing that I still wasn't sure if I was going to get a book deal, but the reporting really incentivized me to keep going. And so then I could rework the proposal and 1 year later go back out on submission and say, here's a narrative nonfiction proposal that really extends the storyline beyond my own narrative and includes all these perspectives from other people. And I could really illustrate what that plus looked like. And I ended up getting more rejections in that second round, but ultimately got interest from a Simon & Schuster imprint. And it was that additional reporting that I think really helped me to be able to get that book deal.
There's so much great reporting in this book. I guess the term that came to mind for me was reported memoir, but it's interesting that it was framed as narrative nonfiction in this case. I was thinking of, stories like David Carr going back and reporting his own story from his memoir. And I see a lot of that in terms of the way you sort of tackled your own story, going into your diaries, speaking with your family members, former therapists. Tell me about that process and when that piece of it began.
Yes. And I will just say that I do very often refer to it now as a reported memoir. I was in some ways using the narrative nonfiction verbiage because I thought that that's what it seemed like publishers would want. And it still rang true to what I was writing. But I find that if you're outside of literary circles, a lot of people don't know what narrative nonfiction means. And so most people are familiar with the term memoir. So I'll usually say memoir or reported memoir now. So sometimes you can change the wording a little bit depending on where you're at in the process. But yes, David Carr was certainly an inspiration to me as I thought about other journalists who have written these reported memoirs. And in many ways, it felt like I was trying to excavate my past. And at times that felt like I was climbing this emotional Mount Everest where it was really challenging to have to go back and reread all of my journals that I kept when I was in treatment, because I kept those when I was at my sickest. And to read them now as an adult is really heartbreaking. I started off reading them out loud and trying to record the readings, but I found that that process of reading them out loud was too painful. And at times it felt like I was trying to do it somewhat secretively because I didn't want my children in the next room hearing about these entries. So that approach ultimately didn't work. And I decided I needed to really just sit silently with these journals and go through them and then just mark off particular entries that I thought were particularly poignant that I would want to include in the book. So I really annotated those journals and included excerpts from them throughout the book. I also went through all of my old medical records, which was painful as well, just because I had been treated in Boston Children's Hospital on 5 separate occasions, twice in the medical unit, 3 times in the psychiatric ward. I had been in a residential treatment facility for 17 months. So went through a lot of treatment and therefore had stacks upon stacks of medical records, which I was able to fortunately still retrieve. But those were so hard to look back on because now I sometimes wonder, I've traveled so far in my recovery and I still have a ways to go. But looking at those records reminded me of how far I have come. And there were some lines that just haunted me and stood out to me that I knew had to be in the book. Like there was a nurse who had said that Mallary simply stopped growing physically and emotionally after her mother died, because it was my mother's death that really spurred on the eating disorder. But lines like that really helped me to see other people's impressions of me at the time. And all these entries, records, they really helped corroborate memory and just make more of the details of my past come alive. Lastly, I also revisited a lot of the places that I wrote about in the book. So I ended up sending a letter to the woman who now owns my childhood home and asked her if I could come see the house when I visited Massachusetts. She said yes graciously and took me on a tour of the house. I ended up retracing my footsteps. I talked in one point in the book about just how I walked to school alone the day after my mother died. And I went to my childhood home and then walked that same walk to the middle school just to be able to re-experience that and feel it again. I revisited the hospitals and the treatment centers where I was. Went to all these different places that really held meaning to me. And that revisitation was a critical part of my ability to access those memories and also to really re-inhabit my younger self.
Wow. What did you discover about your memory going back to some of these places? Did you feel like, oh, this was actually spot on, or this is totally different than what I remembered?
Yeah. So I would say that it's somewhere in the middle. So there were many times where I thought, oh, yes, I remember this exactly. Or I thought that this was how I remembered it. And then went there and said, yes, this is kind of true to my memory. But there were other times when it was harder to access certain memories. Like when I went back to the residential treatment program where I lived for a year and a half, the building that I lived in had been razed. And so I only had pictures of the exterior to rely on, as well as just my own memories, of course. But I felt let down because I wanted to be able to not only walk the grounds of that treatment center, but really get up close and personal with that building and just see it again and be able to even walk through it, which was not a possibility. But in those moments where sometimes it was harder to confirm memory, I would do a lot of interviews to try to corroborate it. So in that instance, I interviewed several staffers who worked at that treatment center in the dorm that I lived in, as well as other girls who lived alongside me. And I actually drew a diagram of how I remembered the inside of the building looking. And I would share it on my Zoom screen. And we would look at it together during these interviews. And sometimes people would say, yes, you're right. This room was here. The infirmary was there. The dining hall was here. But then Other times I would have these little rooms with question marks in them because I couldn't quite remember what was in that space. And the staff members who I interviewed were able to help me to fill in those gaps and to erase those question marks. So that was really helpful, thinking through those moments of just the lack of ability to confirm memory and figuring out as a journalist, how do I go about confirming that in a way that feels really truthful and authentic?
Mm-hmm. Yet there is so much detail about some of your early visits and stays in these treatment centers. And I'm curious, like, what portion of that was documented in your journals versus what portion you're kind of reconstructing after the fact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of it did come from my journals. It was as if even back then I knew that I would one day want to write a memoir about my experiences there. So I just looked back on those and thought, I guess I knew even then, because there were so many details. Like one time I was writing about just this spa night that we had in the residential treatment facility, and I had written about just how we were painting our nails. And in the journal entries, I even had the name of the nail polish color. It was Calypso Coral. And I thought, there's no way I would have remembered that otherwise, but there it is in the journal. And there were so many moments like that where I certainly could have written about those experiences without the journals, but the journals just made those scenes come to life so much more because of the detail that I had included. So in many ways, those journals felt like a gift to my present day self as a writer and author.
And you've known to hold on to them, and you've kept all of your journals over the years?
Yes. So there was a bit of a scavenger hunt that went on at one point because I actually did not have the journals. And fortuitously, when I began the MFA program, my father found them. I sometimes wonder if he just didn't really look hard enough, if he didn't want to look hard enough because he knew that the contents of those journals reflected a very dark time in my life. But I had asked him for a year or two leading up to that if he could go through the attic of the house where I lived in my teenage years and try to find the journals. And sure enough, he did end up finding them. He mailed them to me, and I just pored over them. I was looking through them and just was so grateful that he had kept them after all those years. I also noticed that there were some that were missing. And so I asked him to go back into the attic and look for more. He couldn't find them. But several months later, I ended up visiting him in Massachusetts and went through the attic and was just going through every box up there. And we have kept a lot over the years. So there are a lot of boxes to go through. But I remember there was one box with some of my dad's old tax filings. And in the bottom of that box, there were these 3 missing journals that were from the immediate aftermath of my mother's death. And it just felt like I had struck gold finding these journals because they were so just pivotal in my ability to capture that aftermath of my mother's death. And one example of that is one of these journals contained just pages upon pages in which I would write to my mother. So I would write to her, and then I would include her response in a different color ink. And it was as though I was trying to have these conversations with my mother on the page. And at the time, I really didn't know how to grieve, and I kept up this happy facade. But in the journals, you could tell I was just really yearning for connection with my mother. And so I ended up including some of those passages in the first chapter of the book. Had I not had those journals, I wouldn't have felt comfortable being able to recreate those or quote them from memory.
Yeah, those are really powerful passages in the early portions of the book. I guess this is raising a lot of questions about self-care throughout the whole project, how you set up the scaffolding of support, knowing you're going to go back into this portion, but also stepping all the way back as someone first trained as a journalist, the process for you to embrace the idea of memoir and writing about yourself entirely.
Yes, it's such an important question. It's something I've thought a lot about. I did decide very early on in the process that I wanted to go back to therapy. So I decided that that was going to be an important way of just talking through what I was discovering in looking at journals and in looking at the medical records. Also, just by nature of interviewing hundreds of people, I found that very often I was feeling like a therapist because I was on the receiving end of so many people's stories. And many of these stories were from individuals who are still very much struggling with their eating disorder, or even if they were in a better place in their recovery, they were really going back in time and telling me about some really tough struggles that they had. In some cases, the people I interviewed said that they had never talked to anybody before about their eating disorder, which still gives me chills as I say it, because I was, in some cases, the first person who they really divulged some of these experiences to. So often in my own therapy, I would talk not in detail about these people's stories, but just about the experience of being on the receiving end of them and what that was like to really have to kind of live and breathe eating disorder content day in and day out. So had I not had the outlet of a therapy session every other week, that may have been harder. So that was an important part of the process for me. Another one was just being really deliberate about these revisitations and thinking about just my own frame of mind around that. I always told myself before I revisited places that I really needed to make sure that I visited, but that I didn't get stuck, because it can be very easy when you're visiting places from your past to really then get kind of stuck in that past and to not be able to get out of that. I have this one line in the book where I talk about how I tried to go back to the psychiatric ward where I had stayed on Boston Children's Hospital, and I couldn't access the ward. So I was able to go into the hospital, but the ward has always been tucked away. And still today, it's not very easily accessible. You can't even see it from the elevators. And the doctor who cared for me at the time, who still works at Boston Children's, had said that I just couldn't visit it because of privacy reasons, which I understood. But it made me think about this idea that sometimes places can inhabit our past, but that doesn't mean they need to invade our present. So that is an important motto that I carried through with me during this process. Also, lastly, I'll just say that there were times when I would be writing about something and I would find myself slipping. So I talk a lot in the book about just normalizing slips in the recovery process. And sometimes I had these moments where I could see myself slipping. There was this very just real moment of slippage when I was writing about my experiences binge eating in college. And I found that as I was writing about that experience, I ended up binge eating. I was sort of writing about it, and then I was just eating and eating and eating and eating. And I thought, I need to be really careful that I don't fall into this trap of re-engaging in behaviors just for the sake of feeling like I can access those behaviors more and write about them in a clearer way. So I needed to really try to recognize that about myself, that the eating disorder remains a vulnerability and that I could get into really risky territory if I let myself think that I needed to recreate these behaviors in order to write about them accurately. So that was something I had to be very cognizant about, and also kind of give myself grace in those moments where I did have slips.
Yeah, well, it's conveyed in the title of your book as well. And there's a lot of writing and reporting in the book around illness narratives, both in books, in long-form stories about how we write about eating disorders, and then within your own mind as you've been on this journey. And the middle is kind of a key piece of that, like a key theme within the book. So how did you come to that as a theme, and thinking about the middle, that there not being these very pat beginnings, obstacles, ends, success or failure? How did you approach that?
Yeah, so it was interesting because when I was in my late 20s, I was director of this very small nonprofit. It was called Images and Voices of Hope, and it has since been absorbed by a larger nonprofit. But at the time, I was tasked with essentially helping journalists to tell what we called restorative narratives. And these were stories that showed how people in communities were making meaningful pathways forward in the aftermath of illness or trauma or tragedy. And So often in media, we hear about the trauma or tragedy, and then a lot of times we move on to the next story. Maybe we get a couple little follow-up stories sprinkled in, or maybe a journalist goes back and looks at the 1-year anniversary of a particular trauma or tragedy. But so often those messy middles are overlooked, those sort of times when people are trying to sort of figure out, what does progress look like, and how do I navigate the day to day in the aftermath of something that just feels like it tore my whole world apart. So I was helping journalists to tell these narratives, and I was running a fellowship program where we were giving journalists support to tell these types of stories. And somewhere along the way, I think it was almost a year into doing this work, that I recognized that this could be a really helpful framework for my own story, because for so long I had told people that I was fully recovered from my eating disorder. But in my late teens and throughout my 20s, I actually had been struggling quite a lot with the effects of a relapse. And yet I was too afraid to admit that narrative. And I didn't really think that I could share that publicly, partly because so many of the narratives and books that we hear and see and read on eating disorders are written from the perspective of people who are fully recovered, such that it can make people who aren't feel as though their narratives are either not worthy of being shared or not really safe to share, because it can feel very stigmatizing if you're in this middle place. So I decided that I wanted to think about this restorative narrative framework and apply it to my own narrative, which is then when I came up with this term, the middle place. And I, in interviewing lots of people for the book, realized that there are so many people in this middle place. For so long, I thought I was the only person because I didn't see others writing about it. But of the 700 plus people I surveyed who have lived experience with an eating disorder, 85% said they could relate to it. So there was something there. But there was a disconnect between the sort of populist nature of this place and the actual kind of media coverage and literature that we see about eating disorders. So for me, being able to look at that messy middle was super important, and in some ways felt like an act of courage too, because our society tends to prefer narratives with protagonists who prevail and who triumph over their disorders. But I really don't like the tidy narrative. I'm much more drawn to these messy narratives because I think ultimately they're more relatable. They help people feel seen and heard. And ultimately, I think they can encourage other people to be more open and honest about where they're actually at with their recovery.
Yeah, it seemed like from various therapists that there were a lot of different mental frameworks that one can embrace depending on what works. What did you find from your reporting on that?
Yes. So I was really intrigued by this question of what does full recovery actually mean? Because if you look at the studies on full recovery, there are almost as many studies on this term as there are definitions of it. And this is a known problem in the fields. Sometimes it is defined as being simply about body mass index. Other times, full recovery is defined by cessation of behaviors. Other times it incorporates kind of cognitive distortions and whether or not someone is still struggling with those. But the definitions are all over the map, which from a research perspective makes it really hard to compare data across studies. And it's also why it can be really difficult to say definitively that X percentage of people actually fully recover, because everyone's definition of full recovery looks a little bit different. So that can certainly make it confusing, not just for researchers, but for people with lived experience who are trying to figure out, what does full recovery actually mean, especially when you live in a society like ours, which is really steeped in fat phobia and diet culture. And there's even this term called normative discontent, which was coined by some researchers who found that the vast majority of people in our society have some level of discontent with our bodies, right? So when we know that that sort of is more the norm than the exception, what does that even mean then to fully recover? So for me, it was an indication that, one, we need a lot more language around recovery. We can't have it be so black and white, which it very much has been in the eating disorder field, where you're either sick or you're fully recovered. And two, we need to be able to give a voice to people in this place so that they don't feel so ashamed and stigmatized. And so a big part of this for me as a writer has been really thinking about, how do we think about all of the words and language that we can use to expand our thinking around what recovery looks like and how it takes shape. And it may be that, yes, in the research field, we need a consensus definition. But when it comes to people with lived experience, the kind of definitions of full recovery or just recovery can be different. And if we can expand the way we think about recovery, then it opens up more avenues for storytelling and for nuance.
Yeah, what advice would you have for other journalists on how to, and this goes beyond the questions of eating disorders, but probably all sorts of different stories, to resist the tidy narrative and how to tell stories within that middle in lots of different subjects?
Yeah, so this is something that I really just love talking about and teaching about because it's not something that we're trained to do as journalists. I remember I was recently reading a story about an author who had an eating disorder, and the first half of the story looked at the author's eating disorder from the past, and then it immediately jumped to a paragraph that said that this author was now rosy-cheeked and has 3 children, and then kind of went into just her recovery. And I thought, well, one, that description doesn't necessarily mean she's recovered, but how did she get from that to this, right? Where's the sort of middle? And we just societally aren't really accustomed to talking about the process of how we got to where we are. It's much easier to simplify narratives over time and to just say, well, I had this in the past, here's what it looked like, but I'm better now, right? And we sometimes skirt over that middle part of the narrative. And as journalists, we don't necessarily always ask about that middle. We sort of are more interested in the extremes. But it's in that middle that we find meaning. And it's in that middle that we can really get clarity around who someone is, around what strength looks like for them, around what hardship looks like for them, what resilience looks like. So I always encourage journalists to think about these questions of, how did you get from point A to point B? Or what was that like? Or how do you describe your recovery? Or what were some of the small moments for you that illustrated recovery? Very often we tend to think in more grandiose terms where we say, well, what was the turning point that led to your recovery? And for many of us with eating disorders and other mental health struggles, there was not necessarily one big turning point. Oftentimes it is just this kind of slow accumulation of baby steps, but there are moments maybe that were pivotal in some way, shape, or form. And so being able to get a little bit more granular with our questioning and asking, tell me about a time when you recognize that you made a choice in service of recovery. What did that look like? Share the details of that with me. Walk me through that moment, right? And really trying to kind of tighten our questioning and going deep so that we can understand more about the messiness. I will also say that it's really important to make sure that we ask people what language they want to use around recovery, because all too often it's easy to just assume that someone is fully recovered, and that may not be the language that they want you to use. So whenever I was interviewing people for the book, I would always say, how do you want me to refer to where you're at in your recovery, right? Some people said, I like to say that I'm in remission, or I'm in recovery, or I'm recovered, or I'm fully recovered. And that for me was an act of respect to just acknowledge the wording that they preferred and to then put that into the book. So as journalists, it really behooves us to use the language that our sources are using and not make any assumptions around where somebody's at in their recovery process.
So among the many of the people who you talk to for this book, you use first names only, I think, for the most part. What guided your decision to do that?
So you're the first person to ask me that. And I love the question because it's something that I grappled with a lot. So I use first and last names for the experts who I interviewed. So if the person was an eating disorder clinician or a researcher, I felt like it was fair game to be able to include their first and last name. Of course, when I was interviewing them, I always asked if they were fine with that. And there weren't any clinicians who wanted to remain anonymous. But when it came time to figure out how to approach this for the people with lived experience, I was more sensitive in my approach. When I sent out the survey to folks with lived experience, I did have a question asking if they'd be willing to be interviewed. And so many people said yes. And that's how I ended up finding a lot of these folks who had eating disorders. But when I would interview them, I did give them the choice to either use a pseudonym or to kind of use first and last name or first name. By and large, and to my surprise, most people were okay with me potentially using their first and last name. And so initially I did that, where I would use first and last name for folks who were fine with it, and then just first name for people who preferred that. There were a few instances where folks wanted pseudonyms, but then as I was going through the editing process, it felt a little bit inconsistent. I mean, I do like consistency, and I thought, well, why am I using first and last name for some and only first for others? And then it really came to a head when I was doing a legal review for the book. So it's pretty common in nonfiction to have a legal review if you're with a commercial publisher. And so the lawyer was looking at it, and we were just talking about how to handle pseudonyms. Typically with pseudonyms, you need to make sure that the pseudonym does not have the same first letter as the person's real name, and the pseudonym has to have a different number of syllables as well. And you also have to take into account other biographical details that you're sharing, and kind of tweak those a little bit. To me as a journalist, initially that felt odd because I've never used a pseudonym in any of the stories that I've written. And so I kind of felt a little weird about that at first, but it's very common in the book world. But then as I was talking with the lawyer, I realized that in some cases I talked with individuals who are quite young, right? 19, 20 years old. And I thought it may be the case that 5 years from now, they don't necessarily want their name tied to these really just difficult experiences that they went through. And I realized too that there are many people who share their story with me, but it's quite different to share a story on a Zoom call and to then see it published in a book that is in bookstores. So I decided that I wanted to essentially just use first names for just all people with lived experience. Again, a few of those are pseudonyms. Most were the people's real names, but it felt like a way of protecting these sources. And because I was writing a book and not a traditional journalistic piece, I did have more freedom to be able to use that style in the book.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that a lot lately, obviously, in terms of sources and needing to protect their safety in this current environment. Do you have broader thoughts on journalists and news organizations going more toward first names and pseudonyms when it's appropriate?
I think that we are seeing a shift with more organizations doing that, particularly ones that are covering border issues and immigration. And I think that that's a really smart move. Years ago, I probably would not have said that because I've always believed that we really should try to use first and last names unless we are going to be causing harm potentially to someone. But I think there's so many more scenarios now where we could be potentially causing undue harm. So as long as we have internal processes set up where journalists are in communication with their editors and there's transparency internally around who these individuals are and what their stories are, then I ultimately am of the mindset that it's okay to use those first names, especially if we're clear with readers about our choice and why we're doing that. Gets back to this idea of transparency being the new trust. I think transparency is really important in those cases. But ultimately, we want to be able to tell stories, but we want to minimize harm in that process. And this can be one way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. You noted a lot in the book just how much things like residential treatment have changed. And it seems like for the better overall. Would you say that?
Yes, it has changed a lot. That was one thing I was really keen on exploring was how has eating disorder care evolved since the late 90s and early 2000s when I was in treatment. So that was a really just interesting pursuit journalistically to talk with treatment centers, to do interviews with folks who have been in treatment more recently, to really do this comparison between kind of what things were like and what they're like now and look at the contrasts. So it has improved. Certainly we have now what's called stepped care type of treatment where years ago, you would go from living in a residential treatment facility for a year and then going immediately home, whereas now we have more sort of just stepped down treatment modalities where you're stepping down to a lower level of care, but not stepping down to this extreme of, being inpatient and then going home directly. So we have seen this evolution. We've also seen that years ago when I was sick, the sort of common thinking was that the child needed to be extracted from the home in order to actually be rehabilitated and to get better. And that partly has to do with the fact that there was a lot of mother blaming that used to happen years ago. And the thinking was that mothers were to blame for eating disorders. And as a result, children needed to leave the home to get better. But now we see that treatment is much more focused on empowering families to really try to help their children. And now there's much more of an emphasis on trying to keep children at home rather than putting them into an institution, because there's research and evidence showing that sometimes when children are institutionalized, it can become a bigger part of their identity. That certainly was the case for me.
Yeah. Speaking of family members, how did you engage your family members and your father in this process, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I did talk a lot with my dad for this memoir. I also talked with other family friends and school teachers who treated me, talked with my grandmother. My family is very small, so I don't have any siblings, and I just have a very tiny family. So in some ways that made it easier from a reporting standpoint. But I really wanted to make sure that my father in particular was okay with what I was including. And out of fairness to him, I wanted to make sure that I was involving him throughout the reporting process. So I did a lot of interviews with him. He's not particularly great on the phone. And so certainly we would try to have phone calls, but I felt like I couldn't really get at the depth that I wanted to on those phone calls. He's much better just in written correspondences. So sometimes I would email him questions and he would respond. Typically, if I'm writing a journalistic piece, I don't like to do email interviews. But with my father, I found that he just felt much more comfortable being able to write his responses. Other times I would travel to Massachusetts to see him in person. And that sit down face-to-face conversation could sometimes be a little bit tense because we were talking about really difficult parts of our past. So I, somewhere along the way, realized that I needed to change the setting of those interviews. And my dad is a car guy. He loves Corvettes and Mustangs, and he's always going on car cruises. So one time we were driving actually to the residential treatment facility grounds where I had once lived. And I realized that it was much easier to talk with him in the car because he was behind the wheel. He was more comfortable in that setting. And we also weren't looking at each other face to face. So I said, oh, this is it. This is where I need to conduct my interviews with him. And so I started to then interview him in the car and found that that conversation flowed much more easily. And we were just able to have more natural conversations that way. So they felt more like conversations, less like interviews. And at one point, after I'd interviewed him many times, I realized that there were still some tough questions I needed to address, particularly around just the immediate aftermath of my mother's death, because my dad let me go to school the next morning. I read the eulogy at my mom's funeral without crying, and he didn't really question that. And for a long time, I felt angry about that because I thought, how could he not realize that something was wrong, right? Because part of the suppressed grief is what led to my eating disorder. But the memoirist in me wanted to seek answers and to be able to empathize with him more. So I ended up talking with him and asking him questions about that experience and asked tough questions about, like, why didn't you recognize that I needed more care and love and attention during that time in our lives? And in hearing his side of the story, I could understand him a lot better. And so I chose in that particular part of the book to actually frame it as a dialogue, so that the reader could hear my questions and my father's responses. And that felt like a way of being really fair and also helping my father to have a voice in the book. So because I involved him so much in the process, when it came time for him to read the book, I think he felt like there weren't surprises and he really liked the book. And that was important to me, to be able to share that initial draft with him.
Yeah, what was that like? Did he get an advance review copy kind of thing, or was he an early reader?
He was an early reader, so I gave him a Word document, and it was quite a long document. He said, "I didn't even know that Word documents could be this long." He said, "Can I print this out?" Because it was 300 some odd pages, and I said, "Yes, I just need to get a new ream of paper." But yes, he printed it out and he read it, and I was quite worried because I just didn't know how he would react. There were also parts in the book that really talked a lot about the relapse that I had in college, which I was pretty mum about when I was struggling with it. So I hadn't told him a whole lot about certain parts of my life. And I kind of warned him about that beforehand. I said, there are going to be some parts that may be a little bit new to you. And I just want to give you some context for these. So that way he could brace himself a little bit for those parts. But he ended up really loving it. And when I found out I was going to be getting early copies of the book, I asked my publisher if they would rush mail one to my father because it was right before his 70th birthday. And so they were able to do that. And lo and behold, the night before his birthday, it arrived in the mail, and I was able to give him the very first galley copy of Slip, which was quite meaningful for him. And I dedicated the book to him. So it was a really special father-daughter moment.
Oh, that's great. The other piece of it with family is that you did not tell, you have young children, and you did not tell your own children about exactly what you were writing about. What was that decision like, and how you worked through that?
Yes, it's something I've thought a lot about because my children certainly know that I've been working on a book. And for a long time, they've really thought that it's about my mom. And to an extent, they're right? I write a lot about my mom and just the sort of challenges I had in losing her at a young age. But I, in many ways, have wanted to protect them as well, partly because there is a genetic risk when it comes to eating disorders. So girls in particular who have a relative with anorexia are 11 times more likely to get the disorder themselves. So I, as a mother, have often been fearful of getting into the particulars of my own eating disorder story with my 7-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter because I want to protect them. That being said, I more recently have been thinking about the fact that the book is going to be out in the world and it's in bookstores and on bookshelves. And so there's something that feels a little bit off about this notion that everyone else is able to read my story and yet my children don't really know it yet. So just in the past few months, I have started telling them a little bit more about what Mom's book is about and have started telling them just that, yes, it is about my own mom in many ways, but it's also about how I got sick after my mom died and I stopped eating. I stopped taking care of my body and I had to go to the hospital and I really had to work hard on my recovery. And it's still something I work hard on, and really kind of just brushing it with broad strokes so that they know a little bit more about what it is that is described in this book. And my hope is that they will read it one day. I want them to really know more about who I am. I love this quote from Anna Quindlen, who once said that writing is the gift of your presence forever. So I love this idea that this will be a gift for them for many, many years to come. But I am not quite ready to share all of those specifics with them. And I've thought a lot about this with regard to the book tour. So they're going to be joining me on 2 of the stops. And I thought, should I bring them? Should I not? But I hired a babysitter for my local launch event so that she could just take them to the kids section of the bookstore while I'm doing the Q&A so that I don't feel guarded and I don't feel like I need to sort of shy away from exploring hard truths, but then they can be there for the cake cutting and other fun things. So it's something I'm always sort of navigating just as a parent of young kids.
Yeah. There's one other question I wanted to ask you about the structure of your memoir. Each chapter is essentially your personal story followed by some deeper reporting. That seems to be how every chapter is, right? How did you come to that structure?
Yes. So I love talking about structure and teaching about structure. And I thought a lot about how do I want to actually approach this, knowing that this book is really equal parts personal narrative and reportage. There are a lot of books that are mostly memoir and they include a little bit of reporting, or a lot of books that are mostly reported and maybe have a little bit of personal narrative woven in. But I really had what felt like a Herculean task to try to wrangle all this information in a way that would be cohesive and that wouldn't give readers whiplash. So my initial idea was to take an alternating chapter approach where I would have one chapter that was personal, and then I would have a chapter that was reported. And that was how I initially conceived of the structure in my book proposal. So when I started to write the first 3 chapters of the book, I wrote them in this way. But my editor looked at them and she said, I think that this is okay, but I want you to experiment with something different. And she suggested that I essentially split each chapter into 2 halves. So the first half of each chapter would be very narrative driven, it would be scene driven, it would be written from my younger self. And most of these sort of earlier parts of each chapter would be rooted in the past. And she said, then we can have some sort of visual element separating the first half and the second half. And then in the second half, you can write from your present day perspective and you can bring in all of the reporting that you did, all the interviews with other people who lived experience, the research. And that way, these 2 halves can be in conversation with each other. And the 2 halves will be unified by a central theme. And so I thought, this is interesting, but I don't know of any other books that have done this. And I asked her if she knew of any. And she said, I don't, but she said, I think we should try to make this work. And so I did actually look at David Carr's book because in some ways his is perhaps the closest to this structure, although it's not the same. But I didn't really have a roadmap for this. And I am someone who tends to be relatively risk averse. And I thought, I don't know how I do this because I want some sort of roadmap. But for me, it was this really beautiful challenge of just carving out my own roadmap and saying, okay, I'm going to do something that feels really different and innovative. And I'm going to try to experiment with this and step totally outside of my comfort zone. And so I ended up kind of just redoing my chapter outline with this kind of split chapter approach in mind. And I found that it actually really gave me a lot of freedom to dive really deep into the personal narrative and then dive really deep into the research and reporting. And so if we take, for instance, one of the chapters about treatment, the first half of the chapter looks really deeply into my first hospitalization, very narrative driven. Then we have that graphic element kind of indicating the switch to the second half. And in that second half is when I'm talking about the evolution of eating disorder care and bringing in all the reporting and research. And so each chapter is like that. And it gave me freedom as a writer. It also just enabled me to have my present day self be in conversation with my younger self. And that as a writer to me is really interesting when the different selves can just be talking to one another. And my hope is that this also really helps other writers to think about how they may approach structure when it comes to reported memoirs. One of my early readers said that she loved the structure and she referred to it as explanatory memoir. She said, that's not an actual genre, but she said, I feel like you're carving out something new here. So I hope it does serve as inspiration for other writers who want to do this type of work.
What advice do you have for emerging journalists who are just getting started?
So I would say do not give up on journalism. You're going to hear so many naysayers and so many people who will say this field is dying or there's no opportunities, and you just have to find what those opportunities are. But I would also say that when you're in that first job in journalism, don't lose sight of the back burner project. I think as journalists, we often have these stories we want to tell, but we don't feel like we can because they're a feature story and we're not a feature writer, or just these pieces that we want to pursue, but they keep putting them off. Always sort of just keep that flame under the back burner project going, and find ways to weave it into your day-to-day so that you don't lose sight of it.
I love that. And then what's your favorite part about reporting and writing a story, and your least favorite?
I'll start with my least favorite. My least favorite is getting started. I still today, after all these years, get anxious when I sit down to start a piece. There's just something about that blinking cursor that is daunting to me, and I've never been able to get over that. So that for me is always the biggest hurdle. But the thing that I love best is figuring out how all the pieces fit together. So I love doing all my reporting and then writing out my main themes on either Post-it notes or pieces of origami paper, and then laying them out on the floor and figuring out where everything should go. It really is just a way of being playful with structure and being experimental. And so for me, that's such a fun part of the process. And then once I have all those pieces lined up in the ways that I want, then I glue them down to a big piece of sketchpad paper or trifold, and then I stick it in my office and look at it while I'm writing. And that part of the process is always enlightening.
That's wonderful. Mallary, thank you for this book. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
Thanks again to Mallary for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.